Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. As Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, there was perhaps no one better equipped in the art of politics than Robert Menzies. Menzies saw politics as a noble act of public service. On the art of politics itself, Menzies said in 1962 that it is achieving the attainable, not as seeking vainly to achieve perfection in one stroke. To take a few steps forward in what they believe to be the right direction is all that most political leaders may hope for. Joining me to talk about Robert Menzies, the art of politics today, is Troy Bramston, who is senior writer and columnist with the Australian newspaper and has written 11 and a half books about all sorts of political leaders, including Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, and the half is, of course, his upcoming book on Gough Whitlam. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Troy.
Hi, Georgina. Good to be here again.
It's lovely to have you with me again, your second showing on the Afternoon Light podcast, and we've just had a wonderful event here in Adelaide. So we're sitting in Adelaide, the city of churches, the city that will become the focus of the Big Voice campaign, apparently. So there's politics breathing in the streets.
Indeed. It's been great to be here and share a stage with Alexander Downer, former Liberal Party leader.
Yes, indeed. So, Troy, you have written a biography of Robert Menzies, The Art of Politics, a few years ago now, but you have just re-released this biography with a new preface that includes interviews with the 4 living Liberal Prime Ministers, which is a fabulous idea, and I actually end up recording podcasts with those leaders myself. But why did you decide to write a biography of Robert Menzies, someone who's long dead, a Prime Minister in a time when neither of us were alive?
Well, Robert Menzies continues to loom large in Australian politics. He is routinely enlisted to the cause of Liberal leaders today to give meaning and authority to what their view of the party should be and their vision for Australia. And he is routinely denounced by Labor leaders because he is so important to the Liberal tradition. And he is a very fascinating subject. I mean, the life story is what I'm interested in as a biographer. A guy who was born in the 19th century, the last Prime Minister born in the 19th century, born in northwestern Victoria in a small country town, wasn't born to wealth or privilege or connections, but made his way through to the law, to state politics, to federal politics and to the Prime Ministership. Of course, he's the only Prime Minister since World War II to leave office at a time of his own choosing. He's the longest serving. Yet I was struck by the fact that it's been more than 20 years since we've had a new biography of Robert Menzies. Now, this is pretty extraordinary. In the United States, for example, there are biographies of George Washington published probably every month. So why hasn't Menzies had that attention? And the other thing that really struck me about Menzies was I started to do a little bit of research and realised that out of the 600 boxes or so of his personal papers at the National Library, very few people have actually looked at them. And so I found a number of discoveries going through those files. And also, he had recorded interviews with a journalist named Frances McNichol for a biography that she was supposed to write. This was the authorised biography, but she never finished the book. Didn't make much progress on it at all, but she left these tapes. And I had to get the permission of what is known as the Menzies Foundation, now essentially a medical research institute and fundraising body, and also Menzies' family to access these recordings. So we can see Menzies in new language, his own voice, his own opinions at the end of his life, reflecting on that life. So that is kind of a spine that runs through my biography, which makes it different to the others.
Troy, you mentioned that it was strange how little attention had been paid to Menzies. I mean, I'd say in recent years there has been quite a bit of attention. There's been John Howard's book on Menzies, of course, or the Menzies years. There's been his documentary on the Menzies years to sort of match that book. And then there's been the Menzies movies that was released earlier this year.
Well, there's also been
the Robert Menzies Institute.
Your institute, yes. I was just about to say, which is making an important contribution to our historical knowledge and contemporary issues as well.
Yes, but why is it that formally there wasn't so much attention paid to him? Because You're right. You go to the United States and there's always another biography of JFK or Ronald Reagan or the Bushes or Clinton or Nixon, Carter. I mean, these American leaders, and maybe it's sort of part of the American psyche and culture, they're constantly analysed for what they meant and why they did things and the implications of their actions, their political philosophy and how it shaped America. But in Australia, we seem to, well, at least on the conservative side, the centre-right side of politics, we seem to be lacking in interest.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's worth unpacking that a little bit. Menzies was essentially a black and white Prime Minister. He's in office before there was colour television, long before the internet. So he's from a different age, from a different century. And a lot of people thought he was the personification of kind of 20th century leadership. Others thought he was a stuffy Edwardian out of time by the 1950s and 60s. So that's probably the first thing. The other point I'd make is that Menzies didn't really engage much in post-prime ministerial life. He gave a few interviews, wrote some articles. Of course, he wrote his memoirs, which had mixed receptions, but he wasn't really engaged in the public debate. And I think he sort of left politics and then left it behind, whereas these days you can hardly go a week without one of our many former prime ministers intervening in contemporary debates or talking about their legacy. So Menzies, although he lived until 1978, for the last 10 or so years of his life was rarely in the public spotlight. And the other point I think I'd make about Menzies is that the Liberal Party post-Menzies actively distanced itself from him. And so a number of leaders like Harold Holt and John Gorton, Billy McMahon, and then of course Malcolm Fraser tried to steer the country in a bit of a different direction. And a lot of the things that Menzies had believed in, they gave way to. Menzies still believed in highly regulated product labour capital markets. Well, that was breaking down by the 1970s and was gone by the 1980s. He had different views on Indigenous issues to Harold Holt, different issues on the White Australia policy to Harold Holt. So we saw very quickly with the Holt Prime Ministership moving away from where Menzies was trying to steer the nation on some key issues. So he seemed a little bit passé, a little bit out of touch. And in fact, one of the few people to go and see Menzies in his later life was actually Malcolm Fraser. And your grandfather, Alec Downer, was also one of the very few who would see Menzies on a regular basis. So he was kind of almost shunned by the party in a way. And I think that impacted on how he was seen in the decades later after his death.
You're writing a biography of Gough Whitlam at the moment. Gough Whitlam was Prime Minister from December 1972 until, and you've got to correct me here, sometime in 1975. Was it middle of...
November 1975.
November 1975. So not even 3 years was he Prime Minister. And even if he hadn't been dismissed, he was pretty unpopular by the time he was dismissed. So there's an argument that he would have been thrown out of office by the Australian public at the next election. The Labor Party look at Whitlam as a hero, and the mythology around Whitlam is extraordinary. And, I mean, you're now a scholar of Whitlam. What is it about what Whitlam meant to Labor that gives them this lease on the mythologising? And they really give him a huge amount of credit for a lot of things that his predecessors did, that they were Liberals, or that there was certainly a trajectory from his predecessors to his brief time in office that he wouldn't necessarily, on a sort of, I guess, a fair analysis, be entirely responsible for a variety of the reforms he's pointed out to have delivered. But that kind of heroic worship of Whitlam the man and what he delivered and then what he stood for, I just haven't seen that when it comes to Menzies. He is, of course, invoked in terms of what's the Liberal Party's political philosophy. Oh, we look to Menzies' Forgotten People speeches. We quote, I chose the name Liberal because we're not a conservative party and by no means reactionary. This is trying to define what we are. And Liberals forever have been quoting that phrase and snippets out of Forgotten People speeches. But Liberals barely ever talk about ANZUS as a Menzies initiative, Snowy Hydro, immigration program, Australian universities, ACES, Reserve Bank of Australia, PBS, the development of that, all these things, commerce agreement with Japan. I mean, you know, we could go on listing them because we know them. But Liberals don't boast proudly of that. They don't create Menzies myths like we see Labor people creating Whitlam myths.
Well, I'm not in the business of myth-making,
No.
and I'm not in the interest of hagiography. What I would say about Whitlam is that, of course, he was martyred by the 1975
Yes.
dismissal. So the way he left office is very different to the way Menzies left office, and it's a different generation. I mean, to have voted for Robert Menzies in 1949, you would have to have been born in the 1920s. They were the youngest people to vote for Menzies when he came into power with the Liberal Party in 1949. So whereas Whitlam was very much a baby boomer Prime Minister, a new generation, there is a clear break between what he called the fears and habits and traditions of the past and the promise of the future. So there is kind of a seismic break in 1972 in Australian politics. A couple of other things about Whitlam that I think are worthwhile, like, Menzies created the Liberal Party essentially as the principal person, but Gough Whitlam saved the Labor Party. When he became leader in 1967, the Labor Party's future was probably on the way out. I mean, it probably wasn't going to survive unless it changed its structures, changed its leadership, changed its policies. And so he did that. So he renovated the Labor Party, modernised its structures, and transformed the way it campaigned. So Whitlam is a very important figure in political history and Labor history, even before he's Prime Minister.
Yes.
But then, of course, he does some of the very big things that we still live with today across the policy realm, whether it's foreign policy, health policy with universal health care or education, funding schools on the basis of need, the law reforms, no-fault divorce, lowering the voting age, one vote, one value, anti-discrimination laws. There's a whole lot of things that Whitlam did that have stood the test of time, just as there are things that Menzies stood the test of time. Whitlam actually looked very closely at Menzies and found inspiration in what he had done as well. And there's a famous telegram that Menzies actually sent to Whitlam when he became Prime Minister saying, "Congratulations on joining this club of the highest honour of being Prime Minister." And Whitlam actually said it was the greatest tribute he could be paid, was to be paid that by Menzies. They later had very strong views about the direction of the country as the Whitlam years went on, but there was that appreciation for each other. And Menzies actually had known Whitlam's family and Margaret Whitlam's family, and of course Whitlam was in Parliament as a young MP through most of the second Menzies Prime Ministership, coming into Parliament in 1952. So there's a lot of crossover there, but they're very different personalities governed in very different circumstances.
Yes, indeed. But both absolutely totemic figures for their respective parties too. I'm interested in, you write quite a bit in your biography of Menzies about the early years, Menzies' childhood. It is really humble, but his caricature in his Prime Minister years and latterly, he's always looking well-dressed, double-breasted suit, quite a grand figure. And the stories about how he treated his colleagues, he can be quite abrupt and haughty and dismissive of nonsense and absolutely take no prisoners type personality. How does that identity, and of course he's an Anglophile and he famously says, "I'm British to my boot heels," and so there's this sort of idea that he's an empire man, he's grand, he's someone who is of the rarefied part of Australian society, without using the word class, because we're genuinely not a class-based society. But how does that marry with his roots, which wouldn't have been at all like that?
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't from this sort of born-to-rule establishment, wealthy background. He got ahead not through connections, but through his own determination and hard work. I mean, as we have discussed, he was born in that small country town, which I visited, and it's almost no different to what it was in 1894 when he was born there.
There's electricity.
There's electricity, there's a paved road now, but you can go to the public school where he first went to school, and you can walk past the Mechanics Institute where he borrowed books to study and learn about politics and history and the law. And so that's really an interesting background. I mean, Menzies does come across as somewhat aloof, arrogant, an imperial type of figure, broad-chested, double-breasted suits, imposing appearance. But when I interviewed his staff and his other ministers and his family, they said that he wasn't aloof and arrogant. He was actually very shy in private and could be very, very caring. He didn't show his emotions publicly. His father was a very emotional public speaker. His father had been a politician and a storekeeper in Japarat, and he shunned away from that style of his father. So he tried to present a more sort of serious, austere, focused image and rarely showed any kind of emotion. But that background is actually really important because I think that it shows a bearing, an outlook, a sense of values, a sense of community, a sense of observation about how ordinary people live their lives. And I think that's very important in understanding Menzies' character. And I went to Japarat and I walked that same street. I wanted to know how long it took him to walk from his home to his school. I wanted to know where the Mechanics Institute was. I wanted to know where the popular bars were and so on. And so you learn a lot by studying that environment, and it's very remote. There's a railway line that runs through the city, essentially, or the little town, and he remembered members of the State Parliamentary Committee coming out to look at where the railroad would probably go. So you just learn things about someone by going to where they lived and walking the streets that they walked.
Yes, indeed. I mean, Japarat's really halfway between Adelaide and Melbourne.
Yeah.
So to get to Melbourne, you were travelling, and in those days, you may not have had a car.
Yeah, and that's why it was so important to have that train, the train line going straight to the town.
Yeah. Menzies famously didn't serve in World War One. His two older brothers did, and of course the family had made a group decision, a family decision about who was going and who wasn't, and Menzies was told he wasn't going by his parents because he was the bright boy, and if Frank and Les didn't come back, then at least Bob would be able to look after James and Kate Menzies, the parents. But it is quite defining, that decision. It stays with him throughout life. He receives a lot of criticism, as did many who didn't enlist for whatever reasons, whether they were pacifists or not. They might have had other reasons. It also sits untidily with his champion of conscription in World War II and then in later battles as well. He often spoke about how important it was to be a politician as an act of public service. And I know Heather Henderson, his daughter, has spoken about how being in politics was Menzies giving back, for, especially considering he didn't go to war in World War One. But how important do you think not going to war and not serving in World War One and then entering public service was to Menzies' life?
As a biography, you look for turning points, you look for critical moments that can help explain and illuminate the person. And of course, we've known that story about the two brothers going abroad, his father being emotionally unstable and unwell, his mother fearful and worried about the family, his sister Belle Green eloping and marrying a returned soldier, George Green. She was banished from the family. It was the language that they used at the time. And so we know about this story. But what I think previous biographers and historians have not fully grappled with is how significant and how important it was. Because when I was able to listen to these tapes of interviews that he had done with Francis McNichol later in life, he really did explain that that was the key moment. That's the event that propels him into politics. And he is chasing his demons. That's what he's doing. He's trying to erase a stain that he thought was on his name. And he's looking for, he said, public service of another kind. And then if you fast forward to World War II, when he's Prime Minister in 1939 to 1941, one of the things he does in 1940 is go abroad to London. And he sits in the British War Cabinet, he meets with Winston Churchill and many others, but he walks the ruins of bombed London. And what he says is that he had to do that to show people that he was not afraid, that he had courage. Now, it's extraordinary to hear him later in life talking like that, because he felt even then, he's made it, he's Prime Minister, but he felt he had something to prove, and he could prove himself by being in the middle of the danger, almost like Winston Churchill loved to be himself. And so this is a deep scar that we see running through his entire life. And I don't think he ever really got over it. The fact that even in retirement, he's still talking about this event shows how significant it was.
Well, it's interesting. He's at Melbourne University for much of, in fact, I think all of World War One. He's there from 1913 to 18. And he writes poetry and quite interesting pieces about students who've gone off to fight in World War One. And you wonder, too, whether that is him trying to deal with that guilt.
Yeah, and he joined the Melbourne Rifles, which is kind of like an Army Reserve club type thing. So he joins that group as well. Again, he can't see the action, he can't go abroad, but he's trying to do things to make him look like he's a patriot.
And of course, he has that very unpleasant interaction in Parliament with Earl Page, who criticises him, and Dame Paddy's in the audience, apparently, in the gallery, watching as Earl Page criticises Menzies for not serving in World War One. And I understand Dame Patty was sitting there just sort of about to scream down at Page. Such was her anger at Page for criticising her husband. And she obviously knew how much it hurt her husband to be criticised for something that he would have ultimately said as beyond his control because his parents had told him not to go.
Page had essentially said he wasn't worth the prime ministership because he was cowardly in World War One. But what I found interesting about that is that there was such an outrage within the small confines of the House of Representatives chamber that a lot of your listeners may or may not know that once a politician gives a speech, they get to change that for the written Hansard version. They can make alterations and amendments.
Really?
It happens all the time. And Page actually amended a little bit of what he had said. So he downplayed it a little bit or didn't make it as sharp or as caustic as it was for those who actually heard the words tumble out of his mouth. So if you look at the Hansard version, it's sometimes a little bit different to the newspaper version because journalists are literally writing it down as he is saying those words.
Yeah, indeed. Oh, that's fascinating. There's a lot of, as we were saying earlier, I guess, using Menzies' words, particularly around the naming of the Liberal Party and not a Conservative Party, not reactionary, to sort of claim an inheritance for the classical Liberal tradition or the Conservative tradition or the Libertarian tradition. And, you know, each Liberal seems to grab a piece of Menzies' words to suit their own particular ideology. Is it true that Menzies did consider using Liberal Democrats for the party's name before he settled on Liberal?
Yeah, after the 1943 election, he wrote a little memo to his colleagues in the United Australia Party saying we need a new political organisation, and he proposed it being called the Liberal Democratic Party. And he talked about policies, he talked about presentation, he talked about all sorts of things. And I found this memo and I couldn't believe it. I was reading this in his papers at the National Library. It's one of those sort of lightning bolt moments where you go, how does nobody know about this? And it's signed RGM, Robert Gordon Menzies. And it was such a significant find that I put the full memo in the back of the book as an appendix so people can read it for himself. So this is 1943. This is after John Curtin had led Labor to its greatest ever election victory. And that's what he was thinking about, a Liberal Democratic Party.
So it was something about democracy that he wanted to have in the name then.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the sort of fears that a lot of Liberals had, later Liberals, about communism and about totalitarian type governments, communist governments, governments where there was a big state approach. We saw that in the UK after World War II with the Attlee government, big social services, big health schemes, and there was a fear among some on the centre right that this would stifle private initiative, enterprise and so on. So democratic, I think, is an important word, but he obviously scrubbed that out a year later when the Liberal Party was formed.
Do you know why he did?
I don't know why. I mean, he just decided that Liberal Party was the term it should use. And in his diary, which I found, he said the formation of the party is at those Canberra and Albury conferences in 1944. He noted they were the birthplace of the party. He wanted it to be called a Liberal Party. His daughter Heather Henderson says he never wanted it to be a Conservative Party, never wanted to use the name Conservative. Of course, he had been to London a dozen times by that stage and could have used the phrase Conservative Party, like the British Conservative Party, but he decided not to do that. He was trying to create a uniquely Australian party, and perhaps other scholars more knowledgeable than me might see a deaconite inheritance there coming through in Menzies as well, more of a sort of a socially liberal approach. So I think it's interesting. He thought a lot about the name of the party and how it should operate and where it should sit on the political spectrum. I mean, of course, it's a centre-right political party. It should be in the mainstream, but he wanted it to be a broad church, and that's why so many of those different organisations were invited to those two conferences. He wanted it to unite disparate groups on the centre-right.
Did he use the term broad church at all? Because it's interesting, that's used now and has been for several decades. And we have seen, I mean, at the moment in the modern day Liberal Party, you see conservatives and moderates, they're called, sort of the more sort of right wing and the more left wing of the Liberal Party. Back in the 80s and 90s, in the sort of Howard, Peacock, Hewson years, it was the wets and the dries, so the people who were more in favour of the free market agenda versus the wets who were more in favour of the traditional Australian settlement agenda. In Menzies' day, did he talk about bringing together a broad church of centre-right? I mean, he was obviously bringing together groups, but in terms of the ideas the different groups had, was he concerned about bringing together their ideas? Because I feel like this idea of a broad church is almost a modern-day iteration of how the Liberal Party has evolved through the decades, and perhaps wasn't something that Menzies struggled with as much.
I'm not sure if he used the term broad church, but he certainly did use the term coalition, not in the sense with the then Country Party, but a coalition of groups on the centre-right. So that's what he was talking about. And a phrase he loved and he used his whole life was a revival of liberalism.
Yeah.
So he liked the word liberalism to describe his party, and that's the way he talked about it. I mean, everybody knows he talked about a liberal and progressive faith. Progressive faith doesn't mean a Labor faith or a social democratic faith.
No, of course, progressive is a term that has changed in meaning over the decades, because even back in the 50s and the 10-year anniversary of the Liberal Party, Menzies releases his We Believe statement, which is drafted with others, I should add, and he uses the term social justice as well, which of course these days we would associate with the left of politics. And yet back in Menzies' era, social justice was about uplifting people, giving them opportunities so that they can achieve equality and progress in their own lives and in society.
Yeah, he also talked about a party being forward-looking, a party that had ideas, a party that wasn't reactionary. He'd certainly talked about that, and he wanted a party that was innovative. So these are important things. He knew that it couldn't just be, he said, a critic. He said it's not good enough to just be a critic of the Labor Party. It's got to have its own ambition, its own ideas. You need ideas and policies and initiatives for the people to rally behind. There are a couple of other elements that are also important in the party. He wanted to be a truly national party, and I don't think the Liberal Party is a truly national party anymore. You've got Queensland, you've got a different sort of political structure there, and he wanted a combination of what would be a National Party and Liberal Party. So he wanted a national party, he wanted a mass membership party, a broad membership party. In the 1950s, the Liberal Party had over 200,000 members. Probably today it's got maybe 20,000, certainly less than 30,000 nationally, and he wanted to be a party for everyday people, not just people who were ambitious about getting into Parliament or political staffers or so on. He really wanted a party for everybody, for men and women. And importantly, men and women were supposed to be equal in the party. And the Australian Women's National League, which was an organisation for the advancement of women in society and the economy, they merged and became part of the Liberal Party itself. So it's a very interesting structure, and it's a very different time in our politics. But I think there are lessons that are still valid today.
So in your new edition, where you have interviewed Malcolm Turnbull, Tony Abbott, Scott Morrison, and of course John Howard, you've obviously got some very important insights from all those leaders about Menzies. And you say that Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott agree that the modern Liberal Party is too narrow in who it represents compared to Menzies' days. And I mean, look, you just look at the raw figures you've been quoting, so 200,000 in the 40s, 50s, and it's 20,000 odd members today. I know Jonathan Sumption, who is a former Justice of the UK Supreme Court, quipped when he visited as our guest last year that the British Conservative Party has fewer members than the Royal Society for the Preservation of Bird Life or something. I mean, these political parties, not just in Australia but across the Anglosphere, not the mass party, mass organisations that they once were. And that is partly to do with people living different lives, the advent of TV and other forms of entertainment, of social interaction.
People are no longer joining organisations like they used to.
No.
They're more individualistic.
So the modern Liberal Party in Turnbull and Abbott's view is that it is too narrow in who it represents. But, I mean, can you unpack that a bit more? Is that in terms of they don't have the mass membership to speak to and influence through pre-selections, the development of policy, which comes obviously out of the parliamentary party, and therefore it's just this small group of people who are probably much more on the hard activist level than back in Menzies' day when they were just lawyers, doctors, shopkeepers, farmers.
Yeah, I think that's a factor that has affected all political parties around the world, but I don't think political parties have kept up with the changes that have been going on in society to attract members to them. Scott Morrison told me the Liberal Party structures are kryptonite to members. That's it's a term he used.
Right.
Nobody wants to go along on a Tuesday night and listen to the minutes being read of the previous meeting and then moving on to the correspondence and then hearing a municipal person talk about potholes in the street. I mean, party structures are not dynamic and innovative enough, so they haven't kept up with it. So it's not just about society, it's about the parties not keeping up with that. But John Howard used the term to me, broad church. He very much believes in that, and he says it's got to be a blend of liberals and conservatives, and the four prime ministers agree with that. They agree it's got to be a broad church, it's got to be open to different points of view, and that creates a stronger party, even though some would be more liberal and some would be more conservative than the others. But I do think the Liberal Party structures have become more conservative over time, and I do think that when I interviewed people like Andrew Peacock or Malcolm Fraser or John Hewson, even Peter Costello, have said to me the Liberal Party doesn't have as many small L Liberal MPs or members as it did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So I think that's a valid criticism to make of the party. And I think that a lot of these seats that were lost to Teals at the last election were seats that had been part of the Liberal Party since 1949 in the Liberal Party's ranks, where a lot of its members are, a lot of its donors are, and a lot of the women who became Teal MPs, I think it's wrongly to classify them as kind of like Labor light. I think a lot of them are small L Liberals, professional women, the women that Menzies talked about in his Forgotten People speeches, people that are politically homeless, that are forgotten, that are professional, that are aspirational. That's what I think a lot of the women are that have won these seats, and they are going to keep winning them unless the Liberal Party can find a way to attract that kind of constituent back into their party ranks.
Menzies' 49ers, so the MPs who got in 49, and the first election the Liberal Party ever won, came from a huge variety of backgrounds. These days, Liberal MPs often come from staffer backgrounds, so they've gone to university, they've worked in an MP's office, they might have gone to Canberra and been an advisor and the like, and then they seek pre-selection in their home state and away they go.
And same on the Labor side.
And I was going to say, and then on the Labor side, you get that route, or you might get through the union movement and then into Parliament. This sort of idea that you have someone who's a lawyer or a doctor or a small business owner or in the army, whatever walk of life, but they decide in their 30s, 40s, okay, I might go into politics and represent my community. That seems to be happening less and less. There's an argument that if you haven't had a career before politics, the stakes for your political survival are higher if you've come through the political staffer route, because you don't have another career to fall back on so easily. So you then choose the easy road when it comes to policy. Your policy aspirations are low and you don't have the conviction to fight the big fights on whatever side of the spectrum you're on. I mean, do you think that's true? Do you think there's a solution? I know John Howard's spoken about this and said there's too many staffers, but that said, some staffers is not a bad thing. But yeah.
And there are occasionally people from different walks of life who break through into the party ranks and become MPs on both sides, but often they need support from the party organisation and from the leadership. And I think the party membership on both parties has become so degraded, so small, their rights are often trampled. So I think it does require the party organisation and the leaders to identify people and kind of shepherd them through the party ranks. Just because you may have left school at 14 and done little else other than work for a union and get elected to Parliament at the age of 25, I'm thinking of Paul Keating here, doesn't mean you can't be a policy innovator, even radical, and challenge the existing policy settings, which is what Keating did as Treasurer and did it as Prime Minister, and he was a very successful politician either way you look at it. So I think there's got to be a blend of people within political parties. We need more people who have had military backgrounds, who are doctors, who are shop owners, who are lawyers, who are business people, do all sorts of things. And that's going to make a much better political team, much more in tune with the community, better able to campaign and relate to people and make better decisions. But how you do that, it's not easy. And a lot of people these days are turned off. I remember Bob Hawke saying to me before he died that if you're a young person today and you wanted to make a difference on social or economic policy, you'd probably become an activist. You'd probably try to set up a business that is going to change the way we live or the way we work. You probably wouldn't go into politics. He used the example of when he joined the ACTU in 1958 as advocate. He said these were some of the smartest, brightest people running trade unions then. You know, huge trade union membership in Australia. Nearly half of all workers were members of trade unions. And he saw the trade union movement decline significantly to the point now where less than 1 in 10 are members of trade unions in the private sector. So we've seen a lot of institutions downgrade, but it's incumbent upon political parties to recruit that talent and skill them up. And the other thing, which is a bigger topic, is harder to get into today, but the culture of Parliament, the culture of parties has to change. It has to be more professional, more accountable. There's been a number of politicians in recent years have talked about how toxic the political party environment is. And so that's a turn-off to attracting really talented people. And someone like Robert Menzies, who was a star at the Victorian Bar and had an aspiration one day to be Victorian Supreme Court Chief Justice, he decided to go into politics because he believed in public policy and wanted to make a difference. Now, if Robert Menzies was a senior lawyer at the Victorian Bar today making perhaps $1 million a year, would he go into politics? It's a good question. I'm not sure that he would make that choice.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull was a barrister and a banker, and he went into politics, so people do, but yes, it's certainly the road less travelled. Menzies was very sure that politics was a truly honourable profession. It was a public service, and you went into it as a sense of duty to your country, to your fellow people. I feel like that sense, I mean, at least in the broader society, isn't nearly as strong as the way Menzies describes it, that people think it's sort of an opportunistic career, maybe for self sort of aggrandisement or promotion, rather than to give back. You know, in maiden speeches they often speak about that, giving back and how much they care about their communities. But I think the general public wouldn't necessarily see politics as the honourable profession that it should be, but also that Menzies described it in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah, well, look, we talked about Menzies, but look at Bert Evatt, who, of course, was the Labor opposition leader during the 1950s. I mean, he left the High Court to go into federal politics.
Yeah.
He was the youngest appointed High Court judge at age 34, I think it was, or 36, and he went into politics at the 1940 election and became a minister. Now, the idea that that would happen today is unthinkable. Politics has become degraded. There's been a lot of scandals, there's a lot of churn of prime ministers, a lot of careers have been cut short, but also we're seeing, I think, for a lot of people, they don't want to make that choice. They don't want to be in the public spotlight. They don't want to be away from their families. They don't want to be harassed every minute of the day on social media. They have the most awful things being said about them in that media spotlight. So politics is not an attractive profession for many people these days, and we are a poorer country for it, I think.
Menzies was, you've used this as the subtitle of your book, he was incredibly adept at the art of politics. He'd written an essay in 1948 where he talked about the art of politics. He played a hard political game, but he was civil with his opponents and had very good relations with most of his opponents, aside from Doc Evatt, as you've said. Why was he so good at the art of politics, and perhaps today we don't see such skill in that civil but hard-nosed political way?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have to have some kind of political judgment, which is hard to learn. It's probably got to be instinctive. You've obviously got to be intelligent to be successful in politics. You can work hard at that. But I've always had the view that politics is a learning profession. I've said this many times. The best politicians learn from their mistakes. They face setbacks, but they learn from it. They change course, they consolidate, they rebuild, and they come back. John Howard is a great example of a resilient politician who did that. Robert Menzies did the same. So that's critical in politics. But there are other things too. So you've got to learn the levers of power and the different elements of being successful in politics. You've got to learn, you've got to like people. You've got to be comfortable with them. You've got to be willing to meet them and talk to them and campaign with them. Give people time and respect and dignity as a politician. You've got to be able to be a good parliamentary performer, talk in Parliament, win debates. If you're a Prime Minister, you've got to learn how to run a cabinet properly, a collegiate, cooperative, coordinated cabinet process. You've got to be able to work with the public service. You've got to be a good party manager. You've got to manage your party well. So these are things that you can learn by observation. And so people like John Howard or Paul Keating that have been in politics as a young man and saw other prime ministers up close do these things, learnt from them immensely. And so all of these things are really important in being a good prime minister. And so I don't know that a lot of politicians actually do that today. They actively study the art of being a politician, the cabinet, the public service, the party management, the campaigning, the parliamentary speeches. All of these things are really important, and talking to the media, being able to present a persuadable case for something. So this is the art and science of politics. Menzies talked about these things. The science of politics was developing at that time. He wrote that essay in 1948 for the New York Times magazine. And by the science of politics, we're talking about scientific methods like polling, public advertising, different ways to manage and measure public policies being implemented. How successful are they? Statistical surveys and so on. So it's a mix of all of these things. And it is a good profession in that anyone who has initiative, determination, drive, ambition can learn all of these things, and you can be successful. But we've just had so many prime ministers and so many politicians in recent years who have not been willing to learn and learn from their mistakes and be better at their job.
Yeah. Well, let's hope some of the aspirants are listening to this and can pick up on some of the wisdom, or at least the experience, of Menzies. My final question today, it's completely out of left field, but in the Menzies collection we have access to all the Melbourne University magazines that Sir Robert Menzies contributed to as editor and just as a contributor. And in a lot of them he's contributed poetry, and he writes poems throughout his life. He'll write a little ditty to a colleague or a friend or a family member. He is prolific. I mean, it's almost like a pastime. It's a cathartic technique for him. You devote a whole chapter in your book to Menzies' poetry, and that's wonderful. But why did you decide to do this? I mean, it's certainly not the art of politics in terms of your subtitle of your book.
Well, I'm writing about Menzies the person, his life, what he was like, the values that drove him, his successes and failures, the contours of his career, his family life, all aspects of it. And poetry was something that I kept coming across. You know, you'd open a file at the National Library or the National Archives, and in the middle of some collection of papers there'd be a little poem that he'd written, a limerick, a ditty, some kind of little song. And I thought, what is going on here? And so I started to collect copies of them, and I had so many of them. I thought, this is a way of showing another side of Robert Menzies all in one chapter. Talked to his daughter Heather about it, and she said, yeah, look, often he'd be at dinner on a boat or on a plane, and he would just write down a poem, and he'd often gift them to people as well. They were prized by staff and public servants, and they loved it. And he did it with the media. He wrote poems for the clerks in Parliament. He used to write them and give them as after dinner speeches. He'd mention them. He did all these sort of things, and sometimes he'd be writing things down in the office, and then he would just throw them in the waste paper basket. And so his staff would scramble it and collect them. And his longtime secretaries, Hazel Craig and Eileen Lenihan, they saved a lot of these things and stuffed them into the files to be found 50 years later by me.
By you,
By me. So I'm grateful to them for doing that. And Heather gave me a few of the poems that she had from her personal collection. He'd write them for her birthday or something like that. And so it just shows a different side to Menzies. I don't think he's the only politician who's doing this, but it speaks to a different age of where this was a pastime and a more literate political community too.
Absolutely. Now they do a tweet.
They do a tweet, yeah. But back in the day, they'd read books, they'd write articles, and they'd write poetry for fun.
I mean, there's 2 or 3 bookshelves in the Menzies collection of poetry, not his, but of mainly sort of the romantic English poet. And it's obviously a passion of his. And it shows a different side. Heather Henderson does say the night before a very important speech, Menzies would have read poetry in order to really prepare himself for the delivery.
Yes.
So there's that running through the influence of poetry on his life, but that way he uses it as a tool to communicate in a friendly, loving way, depending on the relationship.
Yeah, and it informed his speech making. It informed his writing of letters. He always wrote things in longhand with a pencil, and then he would write and rewrite. He did that with his memoirs as well. People can go and look at the drafts of his memoirs in the National Library that he wrote in pencil in longhand. And all of this learning informed his political life. I'll tell you a great story that I learned about. One day Menzies was in the middle of a long cabinet meeting. His small staff are sitting in the Prime Minister's office, and he had lost his way on something in cabinet. Very rare for Menzies. It was probably because of Country Party leader Black Jack McEwen had insisted on something. Menzies didn't carry the day, and so he simply got up, left the cabinet room and went back to the office, and the cabinet kept going. And his staff were wondering what is going on, and they went in, to his office, and there he was with steam figuratively coming out of his ears, and he had reached for a volume of Shakespeare. And he was reading Shakespeare to calm himself down and steel himself for the next session of cabinet. And so he's using Shakespeare.
Better than an Instagram doom scroll.
Totally. So he's reading Shakespeare to calm down and relax.
Yeah.
And then he put the volume back on the shelf and went back into the cabinet meeting.
Fantastic.
So could you imagine a contemporary Prime Minister doing that?
No, I could not.
They probably don't even have Shakespeare in their office.
No, I would be highly surprised if they did. Troy Bramston, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time today, joining us again on Afternoon Light.
Thank you, Georgina. Always a pleasure, and I'd want to commend you and your team at the Menzies Institute for doing such a great job.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.